So just who are the people that God uses? We often wonder if they have special traits or if they have skills like nobody else does. And sometimes in our own lives, when we look at ourselves, the things that we see, oftentimes we see them as liabilities, but God sometimes sees those as a launch pad. I'm glad you're here for this conversation today. Hi, I'm Rob. It's great to be able to catch up with you for a few moments here today. Before we begin, let me just remind you of our interactive teaching videos that are available for kids and families, and they're available exclusively on Facebook. A simple search when you're on Facebook for Cabin Kids will get you right there. Now, as we think about our lives, sometimes there are things that are a part of them that can seem kind of unimpressive. There are parts of life that don't always make sense to us, and along the way, there can be places where we're wondering, how could God ever work in this? But today we're going to hear from a member of our congregation on this critical contrast. Nathan Huffnagel has a heart for God, for his family, and for people. And I know you'll catch that as he shares with us today. So let's jump in.
Excuses. It's so easy to give excuses, whether it's procrastinating a job, choosing to do something you shouldn't, or not choosing to do something you should, or even in terms of downplaying your own spiritual gifts. When my son was younger, one of his excuses was, I forgot to do that. And, that's all cute and all, but if we look at our excuses, I'm not sure we'll be saying, Specifically today, I want to talk about the excuses we give to God. Many weeks ago, when Pastor Rob asked me if I wanted to give one of the message in this Not All Heroes Wear Capes series, I had no idea who I'd be talking about. He had a list of people he suggested, and they were all, less than common individuals from the Bible. But as I prayed and read over their stories, I kept being drawn to one who's anything but uncommon. But hopefully, as we talk about Moses today, we will find that we look at him in a different light. And normally he's seen as this biblical superhero. But today I want to focus on his flaws and his weaknesses. And boy, does he have his fair share. Let's pray. God, I pray that you would be talking today, that we'd be listening to you. Thank you that the Bible is filled with people that we can learn from, and not just picture-perfect people, but real people who messed up and made mistakes. Thank you that we can learn from them. Help us to learn from Moses today. As a young kid, one of the Christian bands I liked to listen to was Jars of Clay. But it wasn't until I'd been listening to them for many years that I understood the meaning behind their name. And of course, it's a reference to 2 Corinthians 4, verse 7, which says, "We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." And if you scan through the Bible and look at all the characters, there's maybe only one person that God chooses who doesn't fit this pattern of being a jar of clay. Any ideas who it is? King Saul. On the surface, he looks like he would make a great king. He's tall, he's handsome, but you know how the story ends up, right? Those poor Israelites remembered God's faithfulness like goldfish. Time and time again, they would blatantly choose to disobey God, despite of the amazing miracles he performed right before their very eyes. And in hindsight, they seem denser than year-old fruitcake. But really, are we any different? Anyways, God makes his point when he tells Samuel to anoint this ruddy runt of the litter, this shepherd, King David, to succeed Saul, saying, "I don't look at the things man looks at. Degrees, accolades, appearances, qualifications, titles, ... you fill in those blanks. I don't look at the things man looks at. I look at the heart." And I'm sure every Christian at times feels they are unskilled or unqualified to be used by God, and instead we should leave it up to the professional Christians to serve God in big ways, the Pauls or the Moseses. But let's not forget that nobody starts out as a professional Christian. All the apostles and disciples, they sure didn't. And let's take a look at Moses' life. We're going to see how it starts. And spoiler alert, it doesn't start out very well either. I'm going to outline 5 qualities or elements that make him a very much not ideal candidate to be used by God as a professional Christian. The first one, Moses shouldn't have even been alive. He was born at a time when the new Pharaoh was ignoring how Joseph had saved the country and instead was fearful of this rapidly increasing population of foreigners. He starts by ordering the Hebrew midwives to kill baby boys as they're born. And when that doesn't work, he orders his own Egyptians to throw the baby boys into the Nile. Now, I've been fortunate enough to see the Nile, and I can tell you, in modern-day Cairo, it looks nothing like what it would have looked like in biblical times. It's flanked by high-rises, the water is pungent and disgusting, and normally there's so much smog that you can barely see the pyramids. But if you go upstream towards Sudan, as we were also fortunate enough to do, it's a completely different story. Lush plants now flank the Nile with a sharp transition to sheer desert as you move away from the banks. This would be similar in appearance to where baby Mo was placed by his mother. Point 2. Moses had a secular upbringing. Pharaoh's daughter, we know, goes down to the Nile, sees this basket, opens it up, and feels compassion on baby Moses inside. She adopts him, and no doubt Moses receives the full royal Egyptian upbringing, learning their mythology and their gods, constantly surrounded by prejudice towards his own people and even hatred, being immersed into the etiquette and education of the upper Egyptian class. This was very much a secular upbringing. Point 3. Moses has a short temper, and he's even a murderer. When he grows up, he's out, and he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves. He looks around, makes sure no one's looking, and then murders the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. Many decades later, when he's leading the Israelites through the wilderness, we see other examples of his short temper. He comes down from the mountain and shatters the stone tablets that God wrote the law on when he sees the golden calf. And when the Israelites are complaining to him yet again, he strikes a rock for water twice instead of speaking to it like God commanded him to. And this rash action is what prevents him from getting to enter the promised land as punishment. Point 4. Moses runs away and hides from his problems. After he kills the Egyptian, he flees into the desert to the other side of the Red Sea. And no doubt Moses needs quite a while for healing. Before he's ready to hear from God, he requires time even for soul searching. I would be surprised if he spent a lot of time wrestling with his identity. Here's a man that grew up with his adopted mother, surrounded, as I said, by prejudice and probably even hatred towards his own people. He may have learned bits and pieces about God and his covenant with Abraham from his birth mother while she was initially caring for him and nursing him, but outright murdering an Egyptian is probably not something that came out of nowhere, but possibly out of emotions he had been suppressing or trying to deal with for some time. And when he flees from Pharaoh to the desert, he arrives at a well and defends some sisters who are trying to get water for their sheep. And when they return home from work early, their father asks, why are you home so early? And their answer is in Exodus chapter 2, verse 19. An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. Is Moses an Egyptian? Is he an Israelite? Your identity is pretty foundational to who you are, to your overall mental, spiritual, and even physical health. This was no doubt a big thing for Moses to wrestle with. After Moses marries one of those sisters that he rescued, he starts a family, and he's taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. We see in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, that the old Pharaoh had died, and this was quite a while that had passed since he ran away. In Acts chapter 7, verse 30, it says it was about 40 years. So God gave him a pretty long time to work through things. And that's when God appears to him in the burning bush and says, I've heard the cries of my people. I've remembered my covenant with them, and I'm sending you to speak to Pharaoh, to bring my people to the promised land. Point 5. Moses is extremely reluctant to listen to God. After this long time of reflection and soul searching in the desert, Moses is delighted to have purpose in his life again, and he jumps at this opportunity, right? Right? That is what happens, right? Well, of course it isn't. And this is where I want us to dive in depth into the story. We're going to start reading at Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. The words will also be up on the screen, but I encourage you, if you have a device, if you have a Bible there with you, to flip or scroll there so you can follow along. Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. And this is where we're going to look at Moses giving 4 excuses right to God's face. Think about that for a second. God is audibly speaking to Moses, commanding him to do something, and he has the irreverence, the audacity, the lack of confidence or the lack of faith to offer up excuses 4 times straight to God's face. And we're going to read about them in Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your father has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." And then we're going to skip it to chapter 4, verse 1. We're going to pick it up from there. Moses answered, "What if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What's in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." So Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out, took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was leprous like snow. "Now put it back into your cloak," he said. So Moses put it back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first miraculous sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." Then in verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "O Lord, please send someone else to do it." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak, and will teach you what to say. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform miraculous signs with it." Then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me go back to my own people in Egypt, and see if any of them are still alive." Jethro said, "Go, and I wish you well." 4 excuses. Let's count them up. The first one is, "I won't know what to tell them." Seems pretty innocent at first glance. Moses would have been raised learning about the Egyptian gods, about their mythology, their false gods. So Moses asks the identity of God, the one true God. And God gives him a pretty clear answer. In fact, this is the first time in the Bible when God gives his name, I am, or in Hebrew, Yahweh. And I'll talk more in a minute about why I believe this maybe isn't as innocent as it first appears. Excuse 2, "I don't think they will listen to me." Well, Moses, hate to break it to you, but it's actually part of God's plan for people not to listen to you. And of course, reading later in Exodus chapter 4, verse 29 to 31, we see that the Israelite elders believe Aaron right away when he told them God's message. And notice that it isn't even Moses talking to his own people. But anyways, God answers him with some pretty obvious miracles that he can perform to anyone who questions if he's legit. Excuse 3, "I'm not good at speaking." Well, God's reply to Moses is probably one of my favorite rhetorical questions ever. Who made your mouth? Like, duh, come on, Moses. You know how teachers say, there are no stupid questions? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. No teacher actually believes that. We just want our students to feel comfortable learning. Well, Moses, you're a grown man. You should know that that was a stupid thing to say. He was brought up in the royal Egyptian palace. He would have received extensive training on rhetoric, on speech. And if we look at Acts chapter 7, verse 22, when Stephen is giving his speech before the Sanhedrin, this is what Stephen says about Moses. He says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and deed. Now, there's some speculation that Moses may have had a legitimate speech disorder or speech impediment, but I don't think the evidence supports that, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. I think this was a pretty lame excuse. Excuse 4, send someone else, i.e., I'm not the person for the job, I don't want to do it, just send someone else. It's a pretty lame excuse. It's a pretty obvious excuse. Now, I said I would clarify some few things, and I don't think it's wrong to think logically or think thoroughly or want to be planned about a task. In fact, Jesus himself said that we should count the cost and not to enter a project without appropriate forethought. You can look at Luke chapter 14, verse 28 for the parable about building a tower for more about that. But I don't think that's what Moses is doing here. If we look at all the 4 excuses together that he gives, I don't think it seems like he's coming up with a strategy or being thorough. It seems rather like he's just trying to get out of it. And when God has some pretty watertight answers to his first 3 excuses, then we really see his true motive. Just send someone else. If Moses did have a legitimate speech problem, I think he would have led with that, don't you? That probably would have been his first excuse. Another point is that Moses never actually really says yes. The dialogue ends when God basically says, fine, I'll get your brother to do it. And God also gets extremely angry with him. We see that in verse 14, that God's anger burns against Moses. Now, I might be wrong, but I don't think God would have been this harsh with Moses if he did indeed have a legitimate speech disorder. So therefore, if we look at the whole context of these 4 excuses, I don't think any of them are legit. I think they are indeed excuses. And we can pretty clearly see that Moses was very reluctant to follow God. So let's summarize who we have. And I bet it will make your life look pretty good. Moses is someone whose very existence seemed to be a fluke, whose upbringing was anti-God, who murdered someone and struggled with a short temper his whole life, who ran away from their problems and had a lot of identity issues to deal with, and someone who was extremely reluctant to listen to God. That's Moses for you. And if God can use someone like that, with that laundry list of flaws to deliver his people out of slavery, what can he do with your jar of clay? You see, God has an amazing plan for your life, for my life. And he tells us in Ephesians 2, chapter 10, that each one of us is God's masterpiece. And he made us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. The old, murdering, anger-filled, identity crisis having, excuse-giving, lacking confidence life is gone. And now we're filled with the same power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead. How could we possibly give an excuse for not getting on board with God's plan to do these amazing things he has in store for us? But we do. I do. Don't we? We do give excuses. What excuses do you give for not getting on board with God's plan, for not doing these good things he has for you? I'll tell you some of the ones I give. Other people are better at blank, at serving, at speaking, at sharing the gospel. Moses thought the same thing. God still chose him, though. I don't have proper training. I have a mathematics degree. What qualification do I have to give the Sunday message or lead a Bible study? Yeah, but you might say, Nathan, you're also a teacher. Yeah, fair enough, but ask my wife what it's like to have a serious conversation with her. She will tell you I drive her absolutely nuts trying to form my thoughts into sentences. And it was the same case for Moses. He didn't feel qualified, but God still chose him. And probably the qualification he did have, instead of theological training, the qualification he did have, the upbringing in the royal Egyptian palace, was probably perfect for the job that God called him to. Another one is, I've got important things to do. In the end, Moses just wanted someone else to serve God. But if we truly have our priorities straight, is this not the most important thing we could be doing? Or another excuse I give is, it will be better to do later, when fill in that blank. When COVID ends, when my kids are older, when I can focus on it better, when my work settles down. Moses would have been all too happy to keep hiding from his true identity, hanging out, taking care of sheep, instead of facing his calling and his true identity. And the last one is, sometimes I feel I won't be able to make a positive difference with what I say. But Moses thought the same thing. And why should we doubt the one who made our minds and our mouths? These are all lame excuses. And when I think about it, I'm just as dense as those Israelites, always taking my eyes off God, forgetting his faithfulness, forgetting his amazing power, and looking rather at this very unimpressive jar of clay. But instead, I need to remember precisely this, that's why I'm a jar of clay, so that his power, so that his forgiveness, his mercy, his patience, his love, his grace can be shone through my cracks and through my weaknesses. And when I look at all these excuses in the light of his amazing power, they look pretty lame indeed. So the next time you feel a prompting to serve God, or a dissatisfaction with how your faith is more like a spectator sport than an action sport, or you feel like you haven't been reciprocating the amazing sacrifice that was made for you, don't give an excuse. Don't give an excuse. Talk to someone. Do something. There's a group of men and women here at KS Church that have recently been part of a Bible study looking at precisely this. Talk to Rob and Val. Talk to myself or Bethany. But don't just give another lame excuse. Let's pray. God, I pray that the people listening today would just not listen, that they would do something. I pray we wouldn't be like someone who looks in the mirror, who sees that piece of lettuce between our teeth, but goes away and does nothing. God, thank you that you choose to include us in your redemptive and healing work in this world, despite of and even because of our flaws and weaknesses and lack of qualifications. Thank you for filling the Bible with stories of so many individuals with messed up lives that at times make our lives look pretty good. I pray that we would say yes to you instead of God, send someone else. Help us to see how lame our excuses really are, and give us the faith to trust you and trust your incredible power that has made us anew, and let your power shine through our cracks. Amen.
Thanks, Nathan. That's awesome. Now, let me remind you of our podcast extras that you will find as a link in the description box of both YouTube and Facebook. That link will take you to our church website, where you'll find options for at-home worship, as well as interactive questions for your journaling, or even a conversation with somebody else about what God is doing in your life, as well as some links to our church, and they are great resources for you as you continue to worship at home. Let me also encourage you, before you go, to take just a moment to like, comment, or share about this video, and that is always an encouragement as you do that in those times, and we thank those of you who do. If you haven't taken a minute to subscribe to our YouTube channel or to like or follow us on Facebook, then feel free to be a part of that as well. We would love for you to be able to engage in that way. As always, we're praying for you. We trust you're praying for us too, and we'll see you again soon.